So when you can say, well, what am I getting out of this deal? And I think one of the things that we can get is the freedom to be ourselves and the freedom to say, screw it. If I love making squiggly lines that don't seem to quite add up or make sense, I'm going for squiggly lines because it's my time. And if I'm lucky, I don't have to make the 100% income that I once did, especially if you're past a certain point. And it's if I don't trust myself and do what's calling me now, when do I think I'm ever going to do it? So aging can open up a lot of freedom that way.
Good day, listeners. This is the Spiritual Artist Podcast with CJ Miller, your host. I am calm now. I've got everything in order. It's going to be a perfect interview, and I'm really excited with today's guest. Her name is Sally Jean Fox, and she's a writer, a performer, an artist, and coach who supports midlife plus adults to shape their futures and design artful and creative lives. She's the author of Meeting the Muse After Midlife, a memoir about finding hope and meaning after 50, particularly through creative expression. And I just finished the book. I have it all marked up. So I'm so excited to talk to her about it. She holds an MBA and a PhD from Fielding Graduate University and lives with her horse and husband and some dogs on an island near Seattle. So good morning, Sally. How are you?
I am so excited to be here. I feel like I'm talking with a kindred spirit and I'm raring to go.
Definitely. I have to say, you reached out to me, and I always like to read. When someone reaches out to me, I like to read their book. And so I got your book, and I love to read. It's a ritual every night before I go to bed. The last hour of my day, I sit there and I read. And I'm reading your book, and I'm like, wow, well, this is so similar to mine and different, yet different. So many similar concepts. Definitely more of a memoir, and you let yourself really share your vulnerability and all in there. So
I did. I worked so hard in the early days of writing my book to do a good self-help book because
yeah.
I have a lot to share about what it takes to live a more creative life and really how to change the narrative around aging. That both topics are super important to me. But my book itself, and I think you'll know this from your painting, my book itself said, Sally, it's not working. You have to tell your story. Tell your story, be honest with your story, and then you can share a lot of good information, tell other people's stories. So the book actually demanded that I do it as memoir, and I went kicking and screaming because I didn't want to make it about me until suddenly I realized that's how I need to go.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a same story. I wrote a first draft of my book, and it was convoluted and long, and I had a friend read it, and she said, "Well, first, you're trying to say everything in one book." And then she said, "But tell it from your personal side," which I don't know if you had trouble with this, but it's hard, right? Because we all process differently in a different order. There is no right order to process life, is there? You know?
No, and what made my book particularly hard was, that phrase, you make the path by walking. I wrote the book by walking it because I felt like I had no authority to talk about what I was wanted to talk about without living it. So I was, and what that meant was that when I changed, the book had to change. And when I went through major life events, all of a sudden I'm like, oh my dear, I wonder how that's going to influence the book. So finally I had to put a lid on it and say, okay, this is as far as we go, to be continued.
It's hard, yeah.
Otherwise, the book would just keep changing.
Well, let's talk about this. I want to bring up one thing that really struck me, only because I think it is such a strong issue for people, and it's the story of finding the girl in Madras. Is that how you say it? Madras? In
Yeah,
Madras.
Madras is how I would say it, but
Madras, yes. Um, it's a story about, and the reason I want to bring this up is I do art retreats, and I have found that so many of us are carrying weight, baggage from our childhood, things that were said to us, and things that we haven't been able to let go of, right?
Mhm.
And so when I read that, I was like, wow. And so I don't know if you want to, I'll let you explain the story a little bit about how some boy was nasty to you when you were very young. And
Yeah, well, there were a couple of times like that, and these are particularly vulnerable to me because you want to hide. I had a couple stories like that. One where some really wicked third grade boys, the kind that,
They all
picked
are, yeah.
boogers from their noses and threw them and did spitballs and stuff that was hideous and probably, turned into really lovely people later in life. But they started mocking my nose. And they would turn around and make little grunty noises when I was in class. And, and I was a good girl. And I was a good student, not exactly a teacher's pet, but I really loved school. And they really didn't love school. So
Mm.
anybody who was doing well in school was, a target, and I was a target for them. And they, and it hurt, and it hurt. And I tried to understand, why did they think I looked different? Why was I weird? What was it that they said that was so awful about me? And the part that was super poignant was that I decided one night after being, humiliated in school, that I needed to get to the bottom of what was so awful about me that warranted their teasing. And I went home and I looked at the mirror and stared and made funny faces, where you smush your face up against the mirror and you snort and you make noise. And I made every horrible face I could until I finally found one that seemed to justify what they were talking about.
Wow.
And then at that point, I went back and I thought, well, you can't hurt me because I've seen it. I know what's so bad about me. So you're not going to surprise me with your taunts. So carry forward, like 40 or 50 years, and you carry that, and
Hmm.
you make things like, I can do this, but I can't do that. I can be the smart one in my family, but I can't be the pretty one. I can, I can be good in the classroom, but I can't go on stage because people would make fun of me. All this kind of garbage that you carry for years and years and years. Until one point, I was going through my mom's scrapbooks and her photographs with my brother and sister um, towards the end of her life because we had to clear out her belongings. And I found a picture of me from that very third grade. And it was this little girl with this, little buttoned up shirt in Madras because that was the, 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 the color of the year was this
Oh.
plaid Madras. And I looked at her, I thought, oh my God, she's adorable. She's adorable. She looks distinctly herself. She's, not about to go on stage modeling, but she looks fine. And I realized for all my life, I had carried this image of how horrible she must have been and how weird her nose was and how weird her look was. And it wasn't true. And I actually had a photograph to prove it. And it was shattering in a really good way. It shattered a message that I'd lived with all my life. And what's really cool, Chris, is I went on as part of my just barely beginning art practice to start drawing. And I started drawing people's faces. And I still struggle drawing noses. I think noses are the hardest thing to draw. But I realized that when you approach life as an artist and you start drawing, there are no ugly faces. There's nothing that isn't worthy of being drawn if you're interested in it, And that also shifted how I looked at things because I said, an artist would look at my face and they wouldn't do a commentary. They would just find the life in it and they would
Hmm.
draw it out. And that's how I can approach the world. And that's how I can approach myself. So the art process and the creative process more broadly has become a really healing journey for me. And that's what I really love sharing with other people.
Well, I want to read this. I want to read this line to from your book. So it says, for 50 years, I had carried around the wound of being called pug in third grade. I never wanted to believe that I was ugly, but I tried to accept my fate. Later, as a married woman, I rebuffed my husband's words when he called me gorgeous, thinking he's only saying that because he loves me. Steve was constantly baffled by my unwillingness to accept his compliments. How much of that did you take in? He'd ask whenever he told me I was pretty or beautiful. I think you only took in 65% of what I said. He was wrong. I bet I took in less than 30% of what he had said. When I read that, it just, you just feel it in your chest. And I think, oh, wow. how many of us have had something said to us when we're young, and then the rest of our life, what, 50 years later, and you're still going by that. You're still believing it. And and so for me, what a shift, what a learning opportunity, right? That you moved through it.
Yeah, it was. And um, it was very, it was one of those steps along the road of writing this book because I had started writing the book when that happened. And so I was shifting even as I was writing. And, and subsequently, because I hang out with people who are trying to make art or sing, and I notice that so many of us carry a very painful story from some aspect of our creative path. And singing is a really interesting one because people get really adamant about the fact they can't sing. They'll say, I was told that I can't carry a tune or I can never sing or, and they are fixed in it. But I do these classes and I do work with this woman named Chloe Goodchild who runs the Naked Voice. And Chloe's adamant that everybody can sing because everybody can
Mm,
breathe and hum and laugh and make noise and do all things that are precursor to singing. Singing just adds a little energy to it. And suddenly people start to see, yes, I can sing. I'm not going to the opera, but I can sing. And it's earth shattering. And so when I hear somebody say, I can't draw, I can't make art, I can't dance, I can't sing, I have to ask, okay, where did that start? Who told you? I'm so sorry. It
right.
wasn't true.
Right. I would love to say to the listeners, this is your exercise for tonight. When you get after you listen to this podcast, go out and find a picture of yourself when you were really little. Look at it with what, like, naked, you just said true eyes, naked eyes. Just look at it
Yeah,
and send it some love. Right.
yeah, yeah. And you can do that. And see, that's where your creative expression, because see, my beat is all about how creative expression can help us age in a whole
Hmm.
different way and also can be so healing and life fulfilling. And so when you take that little picture, then I would invite you to draw it if you like to doodle. And it doesn't have to look like anything, but just have the experience of staring with love at what you see or write about it. You can journal or write about it, and that would be great. It's just for you, or sing a song about it. Anything that takes that experience and adds your own makership to it, adds a little bit of you, adds a creative something that will be transformative.
Oh, I love that. I found a picture of myself. Oh, this is about 6 months ago. And I looked at it and I was going to kindergarten. It was the first day of kindergarten. And the way I'm standing, I kid you not, Sally, I was like, oh my gosh, he's so obviously gay. Because I had my hand like this, like I was just doing this kind of posture. And I thought, how did my parents not know it? And I'm sitting next to a Ronnie Douglas, who was always wrestling and he was tough, and Frankie Morehouse, and he was wearing these big pants and his thumbs are in his belt buckle, and I'm standing there with a on an angle, and I think, but what was wrong with that? That right? What happened that I had to hide that, or for many years felt like I had to hide
Right,
it?
right, right. And how the world would be different if we saw the right, if we just allowed ourselves to be right and dumped some societal expectation of what normal was and what we're supposed to be, and really embrace the whole range of how we are. I mean, I think life would be completely different.
Yeah. And so I wanted to bring that up because obviously that occurred young, in your youth, and how it was also part of your process. As you said, you talk about, the book is called Meeting the Muse After Midlife. So you're talking about, aging into creativity. And of course, I think creativity is something you can start anytime at any point. But
Mhm.
I'm sure you hear that, right? People say, "Oh, I'm too."
Well, that's the whole thing. And there's studies that'll say certain kinds of mental functioning erode as you age. And there's all this gloom and doom about aging, or there's some fantasy that it doesn't sometimes cause real problems because it does and all. But I'm like, okay, folks, if aging can be difficult, but it's not gloom and doom, but it's not all roses either, let's invest in what can really carry us forward. And we will have our imagination and our creative powers with us to the end of our lives. I mean, that is a guarantee because it's who we are. So if we invest in expressing ourselves creatively and developing our imaginations and letting that other side of ourselves out, we're giving ourselves a gift that we can keep for the rest of our life. And what else could you do that would have that kind of reward?
Yeah. You know, I agree with you. And I started painting when I was older. I was probably, I think, 35-ish, which is, at that point I had
Not
almost
old, that's young.
I
Oh my
know, I know.
God.
But I
Yeah.
started very small, just a little bit. But I think we all, whatever point, I don't, there's a famous quote about that. And I can't remember what it is, but wherever I start, that's where you start. And in 5 years, I'll be 65 having painted for,
Yeah.
where else can you go? You just do it. And,
Right.
and, but I want to latch on what you said there, because I do think that's something we kind of sidestep. There's two sides of it. There's people that are very, very negative about aging, and then there's people that act like there's no issue, right? Like, and I'm finding this year has been a year for me of discovering some limitations physically, and and there's some truth there, at least in certain avenues. And what I've realized, and what I really like to tell my followers, is that we can be creative with whatever we have. You work with what you have. You know, I tell my followers I have a slight tremor, and it really disturbed me because I'm a painter and there's some shame involved, right? For me, there was some shame involved that I'm a painter and I shake, and I was a little afraid to teach because I thought, well, they're going to see that I shake, right? If I paint alone in my studio, I can fool them, um, but you know what? That's what made me a unique artist, and I have learned how to paint in a different way than other people. And so tell me a little bit about, like, you talk about you had some challenges in going through the creative process. Was there something like that you had physically that you had to work your way around, or?
Well, I have a strong belief that my eye-hand coordination isn't that good and I can't draw and I don't think visually. Those are all
Is that
handicaps.
all?
Yeah. And I tell the story in the book, and this is, part of why I love going on the road and telling about my book is that I'm hoping that listeners will find a similar story in themselves and go, "Oh man, maybe there's a chance for me." Because if there was anyone who was adamant of I don't make visual art, it was me. I decided in third grade that the world was divided into those who had artistic talent and the rest of us, and it just wasn't worth pursuing. So it was just neat and tidy. No visual art. I have no talent there. End of story for
Right.
the next 50 years or plus, 50 plus years. Because it would have been nice if I had started when I was 35. But it took me getting to 68 or 69 and meeting a visual artist who had severe tremors. I mean,
Mm.
like she was like this in our conversation. But she was the kind of person who would just say, "Do you notice I have tremors?" And I go, "Oh, really?" Because it was so obvious.
Right.
And she said, I have tremors. It's a medical condition, but it doesn't stop me from making art. Now, when you hear that from somebody, you go, that woman has a story. I'm staying and listening a little bit longer. And because of how she was, what do you say to a woman who says, come to my watercolor class and I want to, I work with beginners, I work with everybody. And if I can do this with tremors, you can too.
Yeah.
Of course I'm saying, no, no, not possible. But then you're going, that is a really sad excuse. This woman is offering you something so heartfelt and so easy, and you are sticking to your story that is so outdated. So I finally said yes to my new friend Jerry. I'll come to your beginning watercolor class at the senior center. I mean, that was the smallest step you could possibly imagine. And I tell you, Chris, that when I did, the moment that I poured my first wet on wet and watched the watercolor smear across the page, I started crying because I realized that what I had told myself for it was closer to 60 years wasn't true. And I could never go back and say I'm not a visual artist again. I couldn't say it was great. I couldn't say that, I was professional and everybody should buy my work yet, but I couldn't say that I wasn't. And that was life altering for me.
Wow, that's an incredible story. What a release, right?
What a
Just to
release. And so now I've got so much compassion, and when I coach people, it's just like I have compassion, but I also have a commitment to what they can be, what the dream is that lives inside their hearts, because yeah, you may have to modify it, and I'm not planning to go to the, Museum of Modern Art in my lifetime, but I will get the joy of making art. And so there's a way we can do that thing that's our dream if we're creative and we modify it so that we can make it work in our lives.
Yeah, I love that. I love that concept. In my last podcast interview, we talked about that, and he does photorealism, uh, Buscemi, and he uses gridding. He uses gridding to help him control one small area as he goes. And one thing he taught me in that thing that I just loved hearing was use whatever you need, use whatever you need to make it work. And you but you're creative, and if you shake too much, use scissors, cut out shapes, and then layer it on. You can use anything. There is no wrong. I love this one. There's no wrong in creativity, right? I mean, make it
And,
work.
and with how many ideas we had, I mean, this is to the point where I didn't realize that good artists and good drawers could use rulers. You know, I thought
Exactly.
people needed to do a perfect circle without a compass, or if they shouldn't use rulers. And I also, this is one I love, is that I used to joke that my only successful art was when I was 5 and I did finger painting. Well, now I work with acrylic paints, and guess what I love to do? I love working with my fingers. And I thought, well, why was it that I thought that great artists only used brushes? That's a crazy idea, because palettes and sticks and fingers and sponges and towels, I mean, these are all great material. And, but I had an idea that, you know, if you were really good, you didn't do that.
I
Yeah.
think that's what they do. You get scared out of it. You think, "Oh, I have to draw a perfect straight line," or I have to draw, like you said, I remember when I was a kid and people would, I'm drawing a circle, and I'm like, well, I can't draw a circle that perfect, you know.
Yeah.
And you're right. And now I really can't. Depends if I have a cup of coffee or something, it's not good, but
Yeah.
but I think if you just lean into it. I wanted to share that real quick. I just did a talk this weekend on Brene Brown's book, the
Sweet.
the gifts of imperfection, and and it ties into what you're talking about. All these situations that have happened to you, there's a gift in it that you've passed, and including for me, the tremor. There was a gift in it for me to learn a different way of painting that makes it more unique, and that's part of my creative DNA. Um, so that's a great book. I want to go back. Let's ask. Let me. I'm sure. I don't know if anybody's asked you this or they put you under the grill for this, but you have. It says meeting the muse, but there's two muses in this book. So let's talk about the muses and how they affect you and how you got in touch with that part of yourself or what's speaking to you.
Okay. Well, it, there were many things in the book where I wasn't sure, can I talk about this? Or is it going to be too weird? Because you got to understand that, I'm an MBA PhD. You were in the marketing world, so you understand that people expect a certain rational credibility,
Right.
left brain linear thinking out of you. So to be able to say, I met a muse, which for me was like a subtle presence who was personified and came into my life to help share guidance that was really helpful on my spiritual path. And the way she came, I describe it in the book, so I won't go into too much detail, but she came to me as this deep intuitive presence after I had done some toning, so a whole session of singing particular notes. And she felt like she was an elderly English woman with whitish skin and a lovely small smile and a slight hunch and medium short silver hair. And she had warmth that was just exuding from her. And I thought, well, what is this? It was so real that she felt like a presence. And so I just said in my mind, my imagination, I just said, could we have a date tomorrow morning? And so I showed up at 8 o'clock the next morning with my notebook and started, waiting. Will she come? Can I have a conversation with this presence? And sure enough, we started a conversation. And I started writing out what I heard as she was speaking. And we would talk back and forth. And I would have a series of notes every day based on the conversation that we had. Now, at the time, I didn't know. I really didn't know. Is she some extraordinary presence, sent in from God to come through me with messages? Or is she just a figment of my imagination? And I've gotten a little creative on this one. And I was tormented by that. And particularly, because I got the rational thing going until I figured out it didn't matter that artists have muses. And the muse is what inspires your inner sense of rightness. It inspires your creativity, inspires your art. And a muse can be a friend of yours, a historic figure, an imagination, a deep inner, still, small voice within you. All of those have that function of being a guiding force, a muse, or a muse can have this sort of subtle, energetic presence, as mine did. And so as I went along, I called her Isabel. We talked for about a year. And then a couple of other voices came in, and one sounded very different. He sounded male, he sounded more philosophical. He sounded like a mix of John O'Donohue, who I loved, and some other wisdom source. And I just called him Marco. And so I started transcribing him because it was very different than Isabel. Now, at this point, you could call me nuts, but I can assure you I'm not nuts. And the good thing about the muses, as I found them, is that they can help counterweight another force that's in a lot of us that's also imaginal. It's called the inner critic. And a lot of us have a really baked in and very noisy inner critic that I call the gremlins. So in some ways, this presence, this muse called Isabel, was just a counterweight to the garbage in my mind because she was just lovely. She would just say, "Sally, do you think that's really true?" Or "Sally, you're having a hard day. Go take a little walk. Find something beautiful to move your heart." Or "Sally, I know you think that writing this book is crazy, but you also know that you're meant to do it." And she would just drop me these little reminders that made life easier and really fortified my creative path and insulated me from my gremlins.
That's wonderful. I think that I loved what you said. Does it matter where it's coming from? People, is it your imagination? And of course, me, I'm a spiritual artist. So I believe for me, it's my connection to spirit. I feel that I get guidance from spirit. And when I get quiet and I meditate and I'm present, I'll get guidance about what next to do, almost in a sentence structure, like do this, go there,
Yeah,
talk to that person.
exactly. Exactly. And I do think, that spirit comes through and not everybody's comfortable with that word, but
Mhm.
it's so exciting and it's the thing that hooks us to the creative process when you're working with something and suddenly you hear, the book talking to me and it says, "I can't be a self-help. I have to be a memoir." And you go, "Okay." Or you're working with a canvas and suddenly you go, "That color sounds weird. Oh, but I'm going to try it because I just heard that that might be the direction." And you hear it and something opens up. And then you go, "What was that? Was that intuition? Was that spirit? What?" And you go, "I don't even have to know because I took the next step. And look what opened up."
Yeah, I love that. I love that concept of many things you just said. I do think that a big part of making art is listening to what you're doing, listening
Yes.
to the canvas, listening to the paint, and reacting to it, and being open to what it tells, and going with it. A big one is to let yourself go with it, right? Because I was working on a painting a couple weeks ago, and I wanted it to be something else. And it was like, "No, no, we're going this way." And I'm like, "But those colors are too loud. Nope, nope,
Yeah.
nope, we're going that way." And
Yeah.
and so part of, being an artist for me is just letting go and saying, "Okay, all right."
Yeah. Well, I told you I study some with Nicholas Wilton, and he always has this thing where you're working a series of 3 panels, and then you have a play panel. But the thing that we all find, that many of us find, is that it's the play panel, the throwaway panel, the panel where I clean my brush that has the
Right.
fun in it. And then you go back and you say, dang, I kind of like the play panel, the
Yeah.
mess over there. Whereas this one, I was trying awfully hard and, it needs a little love and I'll come back to it. But wow, the life is over here in the play panel.
It
So,
is in the play. It's all about the play, and I call it the rule of medium, being in that middle ground where you're just having fun. And my mentor did the same thing. She would tell us to use 3 different panels, and the one that she would always say your palette. You're going to fall in love with your palette, you know. And I think it's why it's fun. I don't think you should ever. Well, I should never say that, but I would recommend keeping your old canvases. Even if you feel like it was unsuccessful, but just going over it, like turning it into something else. It's never done until it's done. And so I've had some canvases that you can feel it. You can feel whether or not one of your paintings resonates, like you feel like it resonated who you are. So go back to your old closet, open up those old ones, feel them. And if there's one that you can feel like, I never really liked it that much, but people told me it was good, or other people, trust your gut and paint over it.
yeah, I love that. I totally love that. And acrylics are my friend because, I've been in it for now 3, maybe a little more years, and I'll go back to some of the early stuff. Some of it I love, but some of it I'll go, I know a little more now. I can go a little further with this. Okay, let's go back in. And we'll paint over it and let it evolve. And it's wonderful like that. Or if we're working on, paper, sometimes I'll use parchment for my
Mm,
palette or something. And
yeah,
then
me too.
I cut up the parchment because I have these beautiful dried up colors that will go into a collage. And so I yeah, you just keep
Well,
repurposing.
what you were saying
Oh,
earlier when you were talking about visual eye coordination for yourself, I was saying, well, collage is a wonderful medium for that because you can you have time. It gives you a little
right,
more time. For me too, with the trimmer, you can cut out shapes and you can move them around and you can take those pieces of parchment and
right. But the hardest thing, and I bet you would be a great coach for this, Chris, is when you're just in pure play, it's always a great place to come back to. And for me, just the discovery of paint and line has just been paradise. And at the same time, you want to be able to share your pieces. And it was a big threshold for me to have my first little exhibit and to share my pieces for the first time. So now I'm having to walk this tender balance of preparing pieces that I want to share with the world, but then keeping the sanctity of my own inner creative process
mm,
and loving what I do and not getting so pulled into that little tempting thing saying, Is any of it going to sell? Are they going to like it?" Which it's very seductive, you
oh,
know?
it is very seductive. Approval. It's approval,
It's
right?
approval and it's not bad to want to improve your craft or think about how people react and wanting to do your best work or keep improving on things that could be a little better. But how to walk that really tender line that never lets your inner spirit dwindle because you want the approval. As long as the spirit is strong and as long as you're hearing the voice and as long as you're playing, I think you're in that safe spot. But I can feel just how risky it is
Oh, I
to
think,
start wanting to go out into the world.
Sally, I talk about that a lot because I come from a marketing background. And so for 25 years, I had to do designs that were approved by someone else. And it trains you to always think it's a good thing and a bad thing. It trains you to always think about the recipient, but then you have to keep true to your inner knowing, right? And so you're right. It's a challenge. Like you sit there and go, well, I know that this look will sell, but do you really still want to do it? Like I have certain looks. Oh, I know people love that. But when I do it, I'm like, oh, it's just I'm tired. It's just boring to me. Well, I feel like I have to turn towards the newness because it's that exciting edge. Like it's when it's the edge of excitement. And for me, the most wonderful pieces are those ones where when I'm working on, I'm going, oh my God, oh my gosh, what am I doing here? This is breaking rules. It's breaking texture. It's doing weird line work. It's showing that I'm making wiggly, sloppy lines. And yet, just
Mhm.
let it
Yeah.
happen. You
And
know?
that's the gift of being a post midlife or an older creative, I think, because, there's a lot that'll get taken away. Some of our physical capabilities, occasionally our mental capability,
Yeah.
and we will face grief and loss. It just comes with the train.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's for sure. They talk about most people with spiritual evolution. It happens after 50 because there's a point, you play the game, right? For the first 20, 30 years, you play the game. You get the job and you're rising up and you're making the money, you have the pretty house and you have the 2.2 kids, and all those things if you can. But when you get to 50, you're like, but does that am I happy? You know?
Ah, so true. I mean, I was fortunate. I fell into the work of Richard Rohr, the Franciscan
Mm.
father
I
out of
love him, love him.
Albuquerque. Yeah, I adore his work. It's very ecumenical. Anybody can read it. You don't have to be Catholic. But his whole concept of the two halves of life, the one where you build up an infrastructure and often an ego to go with it, and it's good. It's what you need to do to kind of get money in the bank and have your home and your house and your kids and all that. And
Right.
then the second half, you begin to take it apart for something bigger and something inner and something spiritual. And so that's when you can start feeling crazy. Like, I always loved this. This was who I was, and this worked for me. Why am I taking it apart and walking out into the wilderness? Well, it's because it's what you're meant to do in the second half of life. It's different.
It is. It is. I love that. I love that you're quoting Richard Rohr because I love him. I love his teachings. Are you Catholic? Were you raised Catholic?
No, I
Oh,
wasn't.
I was raised Catholic, so it's quite interesting to read his material. But lovely perspective on he has, and I get his newsletter every week. Um, that's true. I think part of that is there's a very vulnerableness to that. You're almost saying, but do I really need you're kind of encouraged too. I would say there's a lot of courage too, because when you take all those things away, there's a safety, right? Oh, I have the big house or a nice car, and we hide in that. And you have to be vulnerable and courageous to let it go.
Yeah, and you go to a party and you say, instead of being able to say, in my case, I teach at a university and I'm an organizational consultant and I have this, these clients
Right.
or whatever. And okay, I got an identity. Pleased to meet you. And to be able to say, um, well, I'm not retired, but I'm not working and I'm not making a lot of money, but I'm exploring in a way that is so fruitful for me. And I feel so alive. And people kind of look at you like, um, I don't really I can't place you. I don't have a good label because I don't quite understand what you're doing because you don't quite understand what you're doing, but you're in this zone and so be it. We like to label people, and when you go label free, it's a little scary,
It
especially at
is.
parties. Yeah.
Oh, it is. No, you're right. At events and I think the people that will recognize you are people like you. Because I would
Mhm.
recognize what you're saying, but you're
Yeah.
right. So many people are like, "Oh, well, do you drive? Or where do you go to school? Where do your children go to school?" And all this, and you're like, "Ugh."
Yeah, or I mean, you're worse. You say, I'm a spiritual artist. You go, well, do you like draw angels on postcards? Or, what is
Oh,
it
that
that you
that
do?
it's a very interesting, that's a very interesting word I found. And since you brought that up, I want to clarify that for the listeners. Spiritual is such a tricky word because it's so inclusive. And so when I use the word spiritual, I am using the term as the sense of a, a presence. So before anything is physically manifested, there is an idea or a thought or a spiritual, a in the spirit realm before it becomes manifested. Everything that has been manifested on this planet, from this computer that we're looking at to the microphone, was some idea in someone's mind. It was in the spiritual realm. So as a spiritual artist, I try to teach people to put down the pencils and worrying about all the physical things around them and focus on the thoughts that they're thinking and the emotions that they're having and the beliefs that they believe, the spiritual realm of who they are. And I love how you said that. So when you get older, for me, I'm taking away all the material things
Mm.
and getting down to the spiritual truth of who I am.
I love that, and your book abounds in that, and you're so clear and out there about it, which is, and you make it accessible, whether you consider yourself spiritual, religious, or not. But I came from a sort of different story because when I had an opportunity to design from the ground up a new kind of business school, a graduate management program, and I wanted one that honored the whole person.
Mm.
And for me, the whole person was mind, body, soul, spirit, whole, our emotional life, our thinking life, our consciousness life, all of it. So I use those kinds of words. And the university that I submitted the proposal to was all on board. They thought management programs made money, so they wanted it. But I looked at the proposal as it came back from the university VP, and he had red penned every reference to spiritual. He
Ugh.
just red penned it. And I was even at on my campus. It was a natural word. We were a holistic learning center. We used words like that, but not at the mothership. They and and that was the kind of skitsy existence I had of people who are around me know that about me. They feel it. But in the consulting world, I had to be really careful in my language, not to use it in a certain way. But here I am writing a memoir. It's my memoir. Hello. But which part of me is writing it? Do I still want to be credible in that old organizational
Oh, I
world?
remember reading about that. Yeah. Mm.
Or am I free to start speaking from the heart and saying, I love God. I'm a spiritual seeker. I'm a woman of faith. I don't love dogma. I don't go around judging people. I hate the idea of a judging and hateful God. It's not in my vocabulary. But frankly, I do I do believe, And those words are really precious, but they're terribly tender
Yeah.
because they're so personal. And I feel my most vulnerable with that.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Because of that other background,
Oh,
because
yeah.
I wanted to be a credible, blue blooded, probably male
Yeah.
consultant who could get a lot of work for getting the job done,
Right.
not this woman who had a mystical tendency, who who wanted to listen to the still small voice and the whispers and the world that lived beyond that. And we all know there's a beyond what we see, but it was a little that wasn't the vocabulary that I used when I was doing my early consulting.
Yeah, that's that whole thing, and that's one of the gifts, right? You can let that just, "Ugh, I don't wanna play that game. I don't wanna play." My son said to me, "I don't wanna be in that matrix."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, even talking to you, it's a podcast, there'll be a number of people listening. I go, even the God word is so suspect. And I don't expect anybody to share my language or my beliefs. I will not impose on anybody else, and there are a thousand ways to say it. But I want to say a few words the way I like to say them.
right.
And I want to say things that are important to me. And okay. And I want to leave permission for you to do the same. And if I lose a few, well, I'm sorry. But I think it's time to be able to do that.
I agree. I talked about that, but I just think words are just words, and they're never see, words are physical, and they're never going to be as strong as that spiritual essence, the spiritual truth. And so we run around, and one person wants to call it Allah, God, Jesus Christ, Mother Nature, the environment, Buddha, and all those are great words. But that was a big step for me. I remember realizing that because I would when I was younger, they teach you to be offended, right? If you don't use my word, it's offensive. Well, so I remember going through a drive-through of, I think it was a Brahms or something, and the woman said, "God bless you," and I and I got triggered. My shoulders would get stiff, and I'm like, Don't tell me what about your God, and don't you know." And when I realized spiritually that really what that person was doing was they were wishing me goodness.
Mhm.
Let's go beyond the word. Let's go back to the spiritual essence, the behind the physical manifestation. She was wishing me goodness. And here I was getting offended by it. And so I thought, oh, thank you. God bless you too. I wish you goodness as well. And
Right, right.
and I
And
will use the term that you want. It doesn't bother. It doesn't hurt me to honor your term.
Right. And can we go back to basics and just say, do you love deeply? Do you help
Mm,
people in life? Do you forgive? Do you seek joy? Do you seek that for other people? Do you want to eliminate the senseless suffering in the world? Tell me, show me. And that will speak to me. And the words that you use, okay, you choose them.
yeah.
But I can sense it when you love. And to me that's the most important thing.
Right. And I like to use this term, hold the word lightly. It's just a word. There is no
Yeah,
word that fully summarizes the essence of what it's talking about. So just
right.
hold it lightly and just
Lightly.
say,
I love that. Yeah,
yeah, oh, okay, so this person's using this term and I love this conversation. I do. I love that you brought this up because it's very real and it's very, to me, spiritual is the essence that goes on. The
right,
body, well, it's for me, there's things falling apart constantly, things are changing. The body will leave me, but that spiritual essence of who I am, and
right.
I like to think of that as love,
Hmm.
will continue on,
Yeah.
you know?
And it just occurred to me for the first time, and I so I appreciate this conversation so much. But it's that the right that we claim to say I'm a spiritual being, or I can choose words that mean something to me, and I can I can honor my faith and honor yours. It's the same spirit that allows us to say I'm an artist, because I say I'm an artist. And I think that's you have two parts, spiritual and artist, and they both require that we trust ourselves to believe in who we are and to say who we are, if only to ourselves, and to know that we get to set this, we get to write the score.
Right. Right. Um, I love that. And it's acknowledging the wholeness of who we are. You know, I read, part of my spiritual practice is every morning I read something motivational that lifts me up. Um, and I've been reading Pema Children. Are you familiar with her?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Pima Chodron, I think.
She's
Yeah,
wonderful, wonderful. But I'll read something and meditate on it. And then, but I also realized sometimes, then I'll put it down and I just feel it, you know? I just
wow,
feel the essence of it. And so I read it, but then I also put it down and notice the spiritual around me. I feel it in the room. I'll see the light. And it's my meditation is to just feel that energy around me, you know?
that is. I've heard spiritual teachers talk about reading in that way. That is, but I haven't talked to anybody who's actually done that work of reading the words and then allowing it to go out so that you feel it and it resonates in your imagination and it informs what you sense around you. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's that whole division between doing and being, right? We in the West we're taught to do, and that's a lot of what we do in the first 50 years of our life. We do things. And I'm not saying we still do things physically, but after 50 we can be. We can be. Well, we can be 50. We can be anytime, but after 50 we're almost forced to start focusing on just being the presence, you know?
Mm, yeah, yeah, yeah,
And then when you take that being and mix it in with doing, right? Like you're doing.
yeah,
There was something I loved about your book. There's so many similarities between you and me. But one thing I wanted to bring up, because I noticed that you have, like me, a lot of passions. I love gardening. I love I have an aquarium. I read a lot. I paint. You have a lot of, and you sing. I don't sing, or let me say, I used to sing.
yeah. Okay, you
There's
haven't been singing recently. Yeah.
right. That might be a new horizon for me. So how did you juggle all those interests? You know.
Mm, like a juggler, you keep crashing balls. You add two, and then you have three or four, and then they start falling out and all. And um, I think I do it. uh, I have a set of things that I love. I have a horse, and I have a
Oh,
garden, and the horse needs to be fed. The garden needs to be weeded. I love music. I wrote the
art.
book. I love writing. I love art. And there's more. I could go on, but I find that I can only do maybe two or three well at a time, and I just have to deal with the pain in a sense of not being able to do it all or all the way I want to. And where it really gets me is sometimes the garden, I just look at it and I go, holy crow, weeds have won. It's 100 to 1 in their favor. But I've got to get the book edited, or having gotten the book published last fall, now I'm sort of regenerating myself with a lot of art, because I think that the art, it doesn't ask me for the same mental work, and it's been really good for me recently. But I'm singing, but my poor piano, I haven't played my poor piano in a
I know.
year. And I keep
It's
saying to it, my darling, I will be back to you. And then don't get back because I get tired at night and it's not the right moment. I just, I just, you know, I cycle. I do what I could. I'm very human, and the thing that is reinforcing is sometimes when I've been playing with art in, say, that deep state, or playing out in the garden when you just feel the garden talking to you. When I come back in and I have to do more linear work or write my work on my book or create, I blog every week, and that's a lot of work, and
yeah,
so
it
I
is.
need focus. um, the art improves the spirit of my blog or my writing. And then when I'm just doing something like ride my horse, I'll get an inspiration that then I'll take back into some other piece of my life. So I think actually these creative pursuits, they work synergistically, and they can kind of build each other. So it seems to be how I travel. I mean, some people could say just do one and stick to it, but it's not like that. You listen to music and your art gets better, or and yeah, or your writing influences your art. It all goes together.
Oh, I love that. I was going to ask you did you think the gift in it was, but that's wonderful. I do think they all work together. I found the same thing. I'll be focusing on a concept in writing, or I'll be taking a class. I'm taking a class on the Old Testament. Believe it
Uh-huh.
or not, I'm taking a
Yeah,
class right now. But then suddenly I'm like, that reminds me about the difference between being and doing, or and they
right.
do inform each other. Such a great
Yeah,
word.
they do. And anything that we do, I mean, the world's a pretty difficult place right now. I mean, you could argue with me, but there's so much suffering right now, and I feel powerless part of the time to change that, except sending out light and love and trying to do my own work and contribute where I can. But I feel like we need embodied experiences that ground us and open our hearts. So, in a way, all the stuff that I've been talking about, whether it's being with animals or being out in the garden or singing or making art, it's physical. It's physical, it's embodied, and it kind of integrates mind, body, emotion, soul all together. And I need those kinds of embodied experiences to be able to weather the storm. So when I go out and I hear some awful piece of news, I'll go, okay, that breaks my heart, but okay, we need to go to the studio. We need to go to the studio. We need to go back to that center point that I find best when I'm in some kind of embodied experience.
Mm, I love that. I really do.
Mm,
That's
mm.
wonderful. That's wonderful. I just glanced and I realized that we're out of time. We're running out of time.
I
But I
know
I know
it's
there's so
it's
much to
your
talk.
game.
I
Well,
know, I know.
I'll come back and you can come talk on my podcast. So
That would be
we'll have
wonderful.
more conversations
I
soon.
know, because there's still a lot that we haven't covered. But
Yeah.
I looked up, I'm like, oh my gosh, what happened? Um, yes, 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 yes. I love everything we've talked about. I was going to tell you that listening to you talk earlier about using your fingers is that your kinesthetic is probably your communication tool of choice. Even though, yes, you write and you sing and you talk, but you love touching. And when you were just talking about doing all those things about the horse and the working in the garden, the physicality,
Yeah.
I give you permission to use your fingers all the time when you
But
paint.
yeah, that's really cool because when I sing, if I can, it's almost like I can feel spirit coming in through
Uh-huh.
a gesture and allow it because I don't have to think what it means. It's just there. And then when I dance, that's where light really just, if I can let go into dance, it's a straight connection. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, is there anything else you'd want to share with our listeners about what you're doing that they need to know before we
Yeah, yeah,
end this?
just a few things. One is that
Okay.
I'm on this inquiry about how to live a fruitful creative life in times of turbulence.
Uh-huh.
And I write every week in my Engaging Presence blog. You can come over to my website, www.engagingpresence.com, and find it. And I think we're in it together. So if listeners have ideas, please let me know. If not, I'm trying to blaze a trail so that we can all keep the spark alive, spark of what makes us human, the spark of our connection, even when we age and even when it gets turbulent out there. So there's the Engaging Presence blog. I also have a podcast where I'm trying to do some of the same and inviting people who spark my interest. And Chris, you're going to be one of them, you know. And then I have a giveaway if you want to announce it on your site. There's a when in my first exhibit, I created something I called a creative manifesto with both points and some ideas around that and a little bit of art. So I have an ebook that includes this creative manifesto. And I actually did it as a flip book, which so it's really fun. You can read it, glean some ideas, some things you could do in a fairly rapid amount of time. So if people would like that, I'd be glad to send it to them.
Oh, that's great. Now, is that on your website that they can see that, how to get
Yeah,
that
yeah. Come to
ebook?
my website or send me an email to sally@engagingpresence.com and I will
Oh,
ship something out to them.
oh, that sounds really cool. Well, see,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
all
yeah,
those years in that corporate world, right? It gives you
yeah.
good support. Well, this has been a lovely conversation, and there's many more, I think, to come. Listeners, thank you for listening to the Spiritual Artist Podcast. Make sure you follow me on YouTube or on Spotify if you just want to listen to it while you create. Also, check out my book, The Spiritual Artist, on Amazon. It's doing quite well. And check me out also on my website, Spiritual Artist Today, for my retreats, which I'm planning one for 2025 that will be in Santa Fe. So I'm really excited about that. I'm going to go next week to Santa Fe and tour the space. And so thank you for listening to the Spiritual Artist Podcast. Sally, thank you for being on the show. It's been delightful.
Total delight. Total delight. Yeah.
And we will definitely talk to you soon again. Thanks again for listening to the Spiritual Artist Podcast. Whether you're watching this show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or iHeartRadio, make sure you choose the subscribe button so that you will receive updates when new segments are released. Most importantly, be still, listen, and know that you are a spiritual artist.